that intersubjectivity thing is, to me, the language of, like, I don't know, the Judith Butlers of the world.
Okay, just shoot me then.
Yeah. and no. We'll simply have to debate this at another time. And eventually you'll give up on your Heideggerian deviationism and come back into the fold.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Yeah. So should I call you Infrared or Haz Al-Din, or what should I say?
Haz should be good because Infrared's actually a collective. It's like 11 people. So I definitely can't just have that name myself.
Well, Haz, welcome to the Diet Soap podcast. I've been podcasting for about 15 years, and I've grown accustomed, as I watch the digital left, to feeling like I'm losing my edge. You've come up, you're a young man, you're making big waves, and I'm glad to get a chance to talk to you. I wanted to just sort of interview you to figure out what your politics are about, what you're doing, and to have a conversation. So thank you for coming on the Diet Soap podcast.
Yep, thanks for having me.
So how did you come to be a leftist?
That's an interesting question, because I'm of the belief that it's like what brings you in it is accidental, and then later retroactively you come up with justifying premises for how you arrive at the position you're in now. So I would say it's really just accidental. I think you can look at many things. You can look at, for example, my background. You can look at my cultural and ethnic and religion. I try to think about this all the time, but ultimately, when I adopted Marxism as a correct worldview, all of these accidental premises and circumstances could cease to be rational causes. You know, they are just kind of like accidental causes, which you can, in a detached way.
Can you give me one that comes to mind that you think was a cause that moved you originally to the left?
You know, I look at patterns for communists historically, like Stalin, for example, and others like Dzerzhinsky, and it seems like they always come from a religious background, and I think that probably has some explanatory value in my case. I grew up taught the basic values. Not by no means was I living in a fundamentalist household, but the basic values of Shia Islam and that specific, way of understanding the world, this kind of messianic notion that we're living in the end times and that the 12th Imam is upon us and all of the injustices in the world and the loss of honor will be restored and so on and so on. So that, I think, gave me a connection to the view, the basic minimal outlook according to which the injustices of the world, the dishonor on a wide scale is something that is accountable. It's something that will ultimately be made to account in a way that is actually of this world, in a sense. It's not just in the hereafter. I think that is a fundamental context for why it just was natural. When I started reading about the Bolshevik Revolution, when I started reading about communism historically and revolutions, right? It was very easy for me to sympathize with those things without having any understanding of them whatsoever. These were revolutionaries that were fighting for justice with all odds against them, right? And, something about that struck a chord in me, even when I didn't know anything about what Marxism was. So it's difficult for me to understand how I got into Marxism without kind of imposing the biases of my current kind of understanding of the cause that compels me. But roughly speaking, I think that would be a good place to start.
You know, I asked you originally how you came to be a leftist rather than a Marxist.
Okay.
on purpose.
Those are separate questions. I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, I think that, would you say that ultimately, when everything is said and done, despite how distorted the left is, especially maybe in the West or in America, that you are still a leftist? Or has your Marxism moved you to abandon the left?
You know, that's an interesting question, because what led me into leftism was, on the one hand, I had this kind of somewhat traditional background. I'm not saying anything crazy, just a minimal, kind of culture of honor and traditional values and so on and so on. Then I kind of am getting interested in communism and that history and so on. And then I come to realize that Marxism seems to be gate-kept and rooted in this kind of unconditionally liberalized, let's say, detached and abstracted community of people who have all of these kinds of views about progressivism. And that was a kind of source of cognitive dissonance, I think, for me. So for me, the leftism was always this kind of force of abstraction for me, of ultimately, this is the truth, and I need to kind of struggle against the biases, which is the inheritance of my kind of traditional background. So that gave leftism a huge kind of alluring, powerful sense of like, this is the fundamental kind of like truth of universal abstraction and so on and so on. The basic community of Enlightenment skepticism. And there's an opposition between your biases and the kind of parochial familiar truth you're used to, and then the one that is associated with kind of the real truth, which is impersonal, which is cold, which is in a sense ruthless and cruel with regard to these kinds of backgrounds. So I had much more faith in leftism, I think, than leftists themselves did. I really was kind of giving it much more credit than what it actually was. But that is why I committed to left. I think this is kind of universal for everyone. When you're a leftist, it's not that you have certain principles. It's not that you're subscribing to certain ideas. It's more that you're committing to this kind of intangible yet I don't know if existing would even be a good word, but this kind of intangible and unconditional community, I should rather say, which is based on skepticism, in my view, toward established communities and norms and prejudices and assumptions. So on the one hand, there's a skepticism toward the norms and the cultural values, but then there's also a skepticism toward, in the American context, the mainstream narratives we're being taught about communism. We're taught Marxism and communism is one thing, and then leftism is this unconditional community formed around a rejection of these conventions of what we're taught. So there's good and bad in that, I think. But
when you say it's an unconditional community, I'm maybe not tracking you properly. You mean that it doesn't have conditions for entry, or that it is very disciplined and will not make not waver from its
kind of the opposite of discipline. It's unconditional in the sense that anytime you attempt to ground leftism in a fundamental principle or a personality or an idea, and you condition it on the basis of that, somehow it becomes right-wing. It becomes a cult. It becomes something that is no longer part of the trendy kind of milieu. Leftism is kind of like something that would be best described in the Deleuzian language. It's this purely kind of rhizomatic community that is totally decentralized and yada, yada, yada. And the minute you kind of attempt to create unifying principles or even just a unifying authority, something about the potency of leftism, something about its allure, something about its power and its the thing that makes it appealing and attractive to people, that all disappears. But on the other hand, in material reality, there are clear conditions around which what we call leftism is based. But when we attempt to critique those conditions, we precisely somehow step outside of the framework of leftism itself, and for many people, into the right. I don't consider myself one of those people, but all these post-leftists that I've seen in the past on Twitter and elsewhere, they all kind of seem today to have been moved to the right wing, right? And for me, just to clarify, I don't mean to ramble, but I like to draw a distinction between leftism and the left as a historical, political kind of tradition within, well, the world, but also Western politics in particular. It begins with the French Revolution. I mean, to that extent, I am left-wing. There's no doubt about that. I align left-wing when it comes to my politics. I identify with the historical and the existing global left. But I think leftism is a novel development which has its roots in, I would say, I would put it to the counterculture, probably the student movements, which kind of took the totality of the history of the left and kind of aestheticized it and made an ideology around it. I like to call it pan-leftism, actually. It's like the French May 68 students who are waving on the one hand banners of Mao Zedong, and then on the other hand, they're reviving anarchism and Bakunin and the black flag. So that is a kind of pan-leftism that's what we're talking about when we talk about leftism. It's really pan-leftism. And that's what I reject, although I regard myself as left-wing.
Okay. I listened to a lecture that you gave at the CPI conference in Austin. Actually, you know what? Before I move to that, I'm going to ask you something else. You said when you were describing yourself coming to the left, you described finding like an abstract truth that forced you to be kind of ruthlessly critical of your own traditional background. And it sounded a little bit to me like maybe what someone who was religious might discover if they studied physics or any science, right? Where, do you think that that's an accurate comparison, that you were kind of led away from your religious tradition into an atheistic and more cold?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, the scary thing about leftism when I was still rooted in my traditional kind of religious background was the atheism. It was these kinds of things. And then for me, adopting it was kind of a way of it's like a dialectic of recognition, of overcoming the alienation represented by leftism for me, that the fear that what if it's this kind of, again, Enlightenment skepticism, like the Cartesian demons. What if this is correct? What if I'm just prejudiced in what I'm born with and what I'm familiar with, and actually this is what carries the truth? So, yes, I mean, I think there's a timeline in which I could have maybe become like a new atheist or something. Maybe, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But to me, there was a huge level of overlap. And I think this is the overlap probably, which also led me to Zizek, at this time. Because, when you get rid of that religious worldview, you need, it's a vacuum, that needs to be filled somehow, that loss of meaning. And Zizek seemed to be able to kind of elaborate upon a very coherent defense, an elaborate, sophisticated defense of the Western Enlightenment and Western modernity, which was simultaneously not, at least overtly, exclusionary and chauvinistic, like white supremacist or something. So this is just kind of myself psychoanalyzing. It could be correct, could not be correct, but these are the connections I draw when I think about it.
That doesn't sound like psychoanalyzing to me, just kind of remembering your own thinking. So the reason I bring that up is because you described the left as being a pan left, or not having any fundamental principles or ideas that is absolutely rooted in or committed to. And I'm not a scientist, but my understanding of the scientific method and the pursuit of science is that you have to remain open to overturning any theory or principle that may have seemed true based on the evidence when you find new evidence. That the scientific approach to knowledge isn't one where you have ultimately very strong or firm or dogmatic convictions. Do you think that approach to understanding society can be political, or do you think that there's a difficulty in trying to impose a scientific approach to knowledge onto the social or political sphere?
I think that, with obvious qualifications, that there are qualifications. I roughly agree with the critical, orientation of German idealism, for example, according to which, yes, you can have a scientific outlook and claim to be that this is totally open and so on, but nonetheless, it is still rooted in a specific kind of particular worldview, which cannot itself be justified by any kind of positive or empirical content.
Right. So you've said that there's something rotten about left politics or leftists today. I don't disagree necessarily, but what is it that you find to be rotten, and how did it become so rotten, do you think, and when did it become so rotten?
I think that this is kind of the same way of saying the same thing, but it is really that the lack of a concrete commitment, right? For example, to a party or a project or a specific even historical lineage, means that you're basically adopting a position which, while claiming to be the supreme moral position, is devoid of any kind of honor. You have no honor to defend. You have nothing to defend. You have nothing to stand on. You have no criterion by which you actually even need to prove yourself, because that criterion is established by the moral pretense itself, which doesn't have to prove itself in any kind of way because it's not concretely grounded in anything in the first place. So it leads to this kind of position of simultaneously like total moral superiority while also employing the most immoral, the most kind of rotten and dishonorable methods by which, that position is communicated and reproduced and affirmed. And not to sound too biased, but I think my own experience entering the scene really confirmed that to me. I mean, the extent to which people resort to dishonesty and fabrication and lies and character assassination and the lengths they'll go to do this. And it's like, where are they getting the sense of moral justification to engage in these rotten behavior? Well, because they have this unconditional sense of moral superiority that allows them to do whatever they want without having to be accountable in any kind of way. So I guess that would be a place to start.
Yeah, well, I feel as though the liberal bourgeois tradition would provide people with at least some good rules of thumb, so they would avoid acting in bad faith and being duplicitous and dishonest and uncharitable and smearing people and behaving in those ways, which is very common online, I think, both on the right and left, but I would definitely say it defines the left scene. So without necessarily having to stand on an absolute conviction of any type that would be unscientific in the way I just described before, and on any foundational belief that you simply couldn't question, right? You could, but nonetheless, you sort of an assumption of good faith is the first thing to start with when you're trying to organize or just to operate in society. So I wonder if what we're experiencing is a breakdown in the kinds of norms that were meant to define even a bourgeois capitalist society today, or do you think that it is the truth of the liberal bourgeois society that this is how things operate?
Definitely more the latter. I think that although it's good on paper, like how the anti-communists say, the kind of liberal, let's say, ethics of the Enlightenment, I think that they fail because they attempt to ground this basic ethical commitment and stance to the kind of integrity of principles and ideas and concepts, universal ones, right? And I think that I would agree with the kind of basic materialist criticism already employed by Marx with regard to that, is that what are the real material premises of these? And then this is the economic. But now that we're in the information age, especially, we have been radically opened to witnessing to what extent the integrity of ideas and principles and values and, you know, even so-called unbiased, scientifically justified beliefs and so on, how much these are actually rooted in social processes. And by social processes, I mean kind of like procedures of recognition and validation and encouragement and, you know, reinforcement and so on and so on. And these kind of are fully clear that, you know, someone who can say that I'm completely unbiased and fully principled and committed at the level of ideas, then they'll get ratioed on Twitter a few times and it's like they'll lose their mind, right? Because there's something radically exposed and naked about how our presence on social media opens us and exposes us to these underlying and hitherto unquestioned social processes and procedures that actually ground our commitments and our position. So I, at the risk of being called a reactionary, I believe in the importance of honor in its more traditional sense, perhaps, that there needs to be a return to that in some way. Obviously not a return that comes at the expense of modernity as a whole, but in the sense of this kind of this integrity, not simply of one's ideas or avowed ethical commitments, but a more fundamental, let's call it subjective and social position, one that we cannot freely establish or determine or decide according to our beliefs and ideas, but one that we are nonetheless grounded within and have to remain committed to. A cheap example of this to me, for example, however unrefined, it would be something like the honor that is bestowed upon in family relations. You have, you know, you can't choose who your family is. You can't rationally arbitrate, you know, who they are, but it is incumbent upon you, and in a way that seems to be sensible to everyone, and in a way that everyone can understand, to defend your family. You have obligations to your family and so on and so on. So to me, this is an example of the kind of honor which is missing from the Enlightenment liberal kind of outlook, but which I think actually Hegel himself provides room for the recognition of in his kind of notion of ethical life in the philosophy of right, which is this sphere of mediation between the selfless universalistic commitments of the state and the civil servants and so on, and then civil society, the sphere of economics and family life and so on. And it's the interaction between the two at the level of ethical life that this older notion of honor, let's say, Hegel provides a rough, however imperfect framework that could be reconciled with you know, the promise of modern enlightenment.
Yeah, I'm reading The Science of Logic now through sublation with a small group of people. We're reading it together, and I guess it must have been like 6-7 years ago. I finished reading The Phenomenology of Spirit, and I recall the sections in that book about Antigone, right?
Yes, yeah.
And I struggled with understanding just exactly what Hegel was getting at, because Hegel is such a contradictory and complicated and frustrating writer. He would whenever you think he's settled on an answer, he'll go ahead and say the opposite or demonstrate to you why the opposite of what he just said is also true. And with Antigone and Creon, the way he interpreted that play, I believe, was that both Creon and Antigone, the private and the public realm, had equal claim to to honor, to being morally grounded, and that because of that equality between their claims, there was a transformative contradiction that was recorded in the play. And what I think that the conclusion was for Hegel was that we needed to arrive at something along the lines, and this is my background, maybe speaking, of forgiveness. A society based on a kind of acceptance of limitation and mutual forgiveness, but that wouldn't ever be worked out entirely peacefully, right? That wouldn't be worked out so we'd all be tranquil, but rather just that it would have to be integrated into social life, a kind of forgiveness, which I think of as being kind of fundamentally liberal, like you understand that other people are flawed, you take them, you give them a charitable interpretation, the most charitable you can, you approach people in good faith, and you understand that as far as you can, for the most part, what you want to do is forgive your neighbor and work together to create a better society. So that's how I interpreted Hegel's ethics.
Actually, I agree with that interpretation and the centrality of forgiveness, but I have a different association rather than liberalism. To me, this is the foundation actually of Stalinism and the kind of scandalous turns in the history of communism.
Okay.
From
I'm
Stalin to
I'm kind of a
Deng
trot type, So like I hear that and I go, oh, okay, this is
yes,
Stalin.
but
Go ahead.
I'll give you my justification.
Okay, justify it. Go ahead.
So in this case, it's kind of like Trotsky is the Creon. He is maintaining this fundamental commitment to the necessity of a simultaneous worldwide revolution, and he's not letting go of it. But on the other hand, there is this more immediate necessity, which is attending to the necessities of and being accountable to the situation you're now in and your culpability in creating that situation. The fact that there is already this community laid before you, and there is already this pressing and urgent task to prove and justify to the masses of people that you won power on the basis of the legitimacy and the truth of that revolution, right? And so to me, Stalinism and socialism in one country in particular, and all of the things that follow from that is, as much as we tend to think the opposite, that Stalin is this kind of ruthless authoritarian and he's just imposing his view on everyone, I think that kind of was, to me, more like Trotsky. Trotsky was the one who didn't want to let go and at all costs, maintain this permanent revolution and, this theory of super industrialization he had, where he was going to send the military to the countryside and forcefully kind of maintain the stronghold of the revolution to spread across the world permanently. I think that Stalinism or Stalin, it's really just Marxism, Leninism, because it's just that the missing element there is the one who synthesizes it was Stalin, right? Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, that is a kind of gesture of forgiveness to me, because it is a way to give way to a circumstance or a situation like, the commitment of Antigone, which is not necessarily compatible with that of the law. And by the law, this is maybe Stalin's anti-Semitism, but what he calls the kind of Talmudist, textualistic view of Marxism, mm-hmm. which is just the letter of the law, right? So socialism in one country arises in kind of a way of contravening that. And then the other one, of course, is Deng Xiaoping, and I think it's a similar situation after the Cultural Revolution. On the one hand, here you have the Gang of Four, maybe they're comparable to Trotsky, and they have this unyielding commitment to fully, carry to fruition the impossible demands of the Cultural Revolution. And then you have Deng Xiaoping, who, while not totally throwing the Cultural Revolution aside, recognizes there's a need for some kind of reprieve, some relief and forgiveness of China's inability to live up to this kind of impossible, demands. And it's precisely in the way that it fails to do this that the revolution itself is sublated and kind of fulfills its mission, discovering precisely what its limits are and what its object was all along.
Well, listen, I'm more than willing as a good Christian Marxist to forgive and forget the Stalinism and the Cultural Revolution and all of that. But what I want to do today is try to understand what the opportunities are for socialism, I think, in the United States primarily, because I think that's where there's the most opportunity for socialism today. And this is, I think, maybe where you and I might disagree, because I think you believe that China is already socialist in some manner, or maybe it's already the dictatorship of the proletariat and not quite socialist yet. But either way, that's where there's the most opportunity. So I want to press on you about that a little bit, because in my good, like liberal Christian way, you said, well, I have two questions. I'm going to ask you the one I wrote down later first, and this is a so-called gotcha question, but it's not really a gotcha question. But today, in your lecture, you said that the best hope for dissident organizing against the capitalist state can be found in the MAGA community, and that whenever it arises right now, it's called or pushed into being right wing. And I understand what you mean by that. I think you and I would agree that Trump himself and the Republican Party is never going to be any kind of vehicle for socialism. But what Trump has managed to do is be the only force that can even stand in for dissonant thought and oppositional thought today. And that's a political reality and ideological reality where we're facing right now in the United States. So, but I've heard that in China, everyday people are surveilled, censored, controlled. And in the United States, those MAGA people who are organizing politically against the imperial state often organize on the basis of protecting their civil liberties, which are particularly American. So they want to keep the right to assemble, the right to a free press, the right to due process. Given that the spontaneous movements organizing against the capitalist state, in conjunction with the MAGA Trump phenomenon, but not directed by it so much, often do so on this basis, on the basis of protecting kind of liberal, democratic, constitutional rights. Why should an American socialist point to the Chinese government as the model, especially given that the U.S. state, capitalist state, appears to already be looking to China as a model for both, and that's happening both in the United States and Europe?
Well, interesting question. I could respond to that by saying that, you see, there is a sense in which MAGA, I would agree, is reactionary. It's not in the leftist sense that, it's because they're bigots and so on. It's in a sense that I think has to be understood in a way that's with good faith toward the fundamental discontent and motivation surrounding it, which is that it's this immediate way of articulating ready-made popular sovereignty in the age of information and cybernetics, which is just totally kind of using within its arsenal to describe the terms of its struggle the old constitutional liberal state. And even Stalin himself in his last speech talked about how communists actually, this is his last speech ever, must be the ones to carry forward the banner of civil liberties and constitutional protections, which are seemingly cast overboard by the monopoly bourgeoisie and so on now. So that element, I think, is already there. But the problem is this inability to understand explicitly that the terms of the old social contract, which was just based on the negative freedoms of liberalism, are themselves culpable in why liberalism now faces the contradiction that it does. That there's a reason why communists in particular have to lead the way, because they understand the contradictions and limitations of liberalism. That liberalism, and I mean liberalism in the classical sense, not neoliberalist Democrats, cannot give recognition to. So when I look at the example of China, you have an interesting situation where if we one for one took the methods of governance and what technology, whatever in China, and gave them at the disposal of the American ruling class, that's a nightmare scenario. But there's a crucial element missing when we abstract from China the pure method of kind of surveillance and technology and state power, which is this fundamental social contract. That is the foundation of that in China. Chinese society as a whole could be characterized by a social contract that's missing in Western liberal democracies. One that takes for granted the recognition that there are obligations on part of the state toward the people, not ones that, could be reduced to the form of liberalism and negative freedoms. But for example, the state, it's incumbent, it's in the very definition of what a state is within China, that it has to be sensitive to the sentiments of the people, to the things that they're thinking about and talking about and discussing, to their economic reality, right? It has to perform. It has to actually show results and yield results at the level of improving people's standards of living. When it overreaches too much in a way that violates people's sense of norms and its sense of, how should I say? I wouldn't say morality. I would say rather values and so on and so on. I see in China a huge sensitivity toward that. I mean, look, we all know the Chinese state, which I do regard as a proletarian dictatorship, doesn't mess around when it comes to people who overtly want to challenge the authority of the state, who represent kind of like, oh, no, we want to replace the party. We want to fundamentally overthrow this. Like, there's zero tolerance for that. Absolutely. But when it comes to the content of people's grievances, the state is extremely accommodating and receptive to those things, in my view. It doesn't, it justifies and proves its authority. I mean, the Communist Party is not just some private clique of people imposing their will on the country. It's a specific and historically novel, one that theory has not done its proper due and really explaining and understanding, I think. Even Zizek, I think, would agree with this. Communist parties are a radically new form of political authority, which have a procedural and processual function and reality that I think Western thinkers are often too quick to dismiss. We just kind of assume, oh, it's just a kind of dictatorship of a personality. But in reality, there are mechanisms and procedures in the party itself, which I think, arguably are more effective at giving expression to popular will than liberal democracies are. And it's the obvious paradox even Karl Popper and liberal thinkers had to admit, which is that in order for a liberal democracy to even be viable, it cannot tolerate the intolerant. It cannot tolerate people who want to overthrow and destroy the very system of openness and so on itself. This is a clear example of the contradiction of liberalism. But a proletarian dictatorship, on the other hand, openly avows the dictatorship of the common interest, the popular interest. It doesn't it doesn't impose the dictatorship of a specific course of direction, a specific ideology even, or a specific line, just the dictatorship of a specific commitment, right? So far as we have a state, the state has to be committed fundamentally to the popular will, to the interest of the proletarian class, to the development of the nation, and so on and so on. And that is obviously something that is non-negotiable, meaning if there are rival claimants to the political authority, they have to be crushed. But on the other hand, if there are people who are aggrieved by the actions of the political authority without necessarily, demanding that it be totally overthrown, then it is incumbent upon the authority to kind of be receptive and take these kinds of things into consideration.
When I think back to the phenomenology of spirit in the Antigone moment, I think that the contradiction between Creon and Antigone was one where what came out of it was what I would call civil society, rather than this purely private realm and the state. Mm-hmm. There was this self-governing civil society that emerged. I think that's what Hegel's pointing to. So when I think about the socialism and what it would mean to actually achieve socialism, not that all the, I'm allowing myself to be utopian maybe, or to, speculate. The primary thing that I think we're after is self-governance. That doesn't mean just licentiousness or whatever you want, you can have, but rather self-control, self-government, but also self-innovation, and self-discovery. And so society itself would be directing its future and interpreting itself to itself and creating a new path into, a new history. That's how I understand the aim of socialism. The aim of socialism is self-emancipation. So another part of that, the Marxist part of that, is right now what's constraining our ability to do that isn't actually the state. The state rises up to try to manage the chaos of a civil society that is not self-disciplined and self-reflective enough. The primary problem that we're facing is that we're stuck being with the labor-based society, a society which is where the value that we produce and the way we distribute society is based on this abstract labor time.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.